Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming over for this curtain raiser sessions on guardians and angels, preventing disinvestment from development. And I think this comes at a very, very important time. We see huge shifts in, let's say, reductions of development aid as we traditionally knew it, the 0.7%. But at the same time, we also see a growing appetite to invest in different ways in development. And I think we have an excellent set of speakers today to discuss these questions. So I'm very pleased to be here. And we've said we would do 50 minutes, but if we have time, we would also try to engage a bit with you guys in the audience. So think about issues you would like to raise. And in any case, after this session, I think this place will be vacated, so we might still have a bit of space in the corridors to continue the conversation. So this is really about geopolitics and the role of aid and also these shifts that are taking place. And to start with you, Andreas Schaal, you are in this field for a very long time. You're with the OECD, the Director for Global Relations and Cooperation, also Sherpa to G7, G20 and APEC. What in today's world drives development, and how is development changing in your view? What do you observe at the OECD?
Yeah, thanks so much, Luisa. Let me start by sending a very warm congratulations to Raisina at 10, because the 10th anniversary is a very important anniversary, as we all have children. So moving from childhood to adolescence now. So please tell Samir that he has founded a fantastic child with Raisina. And we need more of these dialogues rather than less. And so big congratulations for Raisina at 10. Second, congratulations to the organizers for getting the gender balance on this panel right. So I have to say one man on a panel is largely enough. So hope that you can continue keep. Then, to make a long story short, come to your question. I think development is much more than aid. And I mean, here in India, where in the years of 2010, you had 1% of GDP as foreign aid. Now you're at 0.0 something of foreign aid of GDP. And this shows that development can be stimulated or can be supported by aid, but development is much more than aid. Development is about trade and investment. It's about domestic resource mobilization. It's about drivers of growth in a country. It's about institutions, stable institutions, and this is what we are working on in the OECD. So, I mean, I'm not saying don't worry about, let's say, the recent challenges around development aid, around aid effectiveness. I think it's important, and we are tracking this in the OECD. We are tracking the commitments of the donor committee with our development assistance committee. We are tracking the $100 billion commitment of advanced economies for climate change. We will now tracking the 300 billion new quantitative goal for climate finance from advanced to emerging economies. But this is only part of the story what we can be doing there. And this brings me to my third and last point, also in the context of the Financing for Development Conference Sevilla. I think we need to become much smarter in moving together the public and the private sector. So we have developed for the G20 under Indonesia's presidencies and under India's presidency, G20 blended finance principles to leverage public money with private money. And we need to do much more, because if you look at the financing gap in sustainable development goals, we are lacking since COVID $4 trillion US. So the gap is huge. And I think the magnitude of official development aid is around 420 billion, which is available. So this shows you, even if we just continue with what we have in our books, and even if our countries would be in a fantastic fiscal position to deliver more, we would not mirror the challenge of what is needed. So we need to kind of rely also on other sources, and this brings us to the point where we are now tracking total official support for sustainable development, what we call TOSDI, bringing in also other sources, having mechanism to bring in more the private sector, having mechanism also to rely more on the drivers of trade and investment, also in SDG financing and in climate financing. I leave it here. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And also a lot to chew on and to follow up. And what comes to my mind immediately is the Belt and Road Initiative approach, but also the Global Gateway of the European Union that tries to make this bridge, and in any case, the tendency to go from gifts to loans and to consider development more holistically, according to the SDGs or maybe beyond it. And also to see what will be the future of such constructions and the mutual benefits of really bringing the private sector in and partnering with private sector in third countries too. I'm sure that if we have time, that there's also questions on that aspect. Thank you. Let's move on. Suzanne Ferguson, you have an esteemed career within the UN and also with the Australian government. How do you view this shift in development cooperation from the field you're working in?
Thank you very much, and namaskar everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me. I just wanted to say firstly that my comments are my comments. I'm not representing the UN here, but of course I work in the UN, so you know, my own perceptions are, you know, very much influenced by my job, which is the head of UN Women here in India. So I think that there have been, you know, I mean, significant changes in development assistance just in the last few months, and I think we all know and are aware of that. But actually, I think we could sort of even frame this a bit as the beginning of, or the end of the beginning of this reduction of ODA over the years, because there's been many ways that ODA has been shrinking in the last years. And we have only to look at some of the changes to governments in Europe, for example, and others. You know, there are so many political imperatives behind ODA, and we see, you know, different governments have their own views on what should be spent on ODA also, and that is changing all around the world. So, you know, I think some of the other things that are very obvious is the amount of money on defence spending is impacting on the amount of ODA that's available. And we live in a world that's changing all the time. You know, these conflicts are increasing, I would say, and more funding is being spent to deal with them. So I think there's other changes to ODA, which is about, you know, governments count their financing of peacekeeping, for example, or support for refugees within their own countries as ODA. So what aid is being spent on is also changing, and that is changing the whole sort of landscape of aid and development around the world. So, but I do have to say, despite this, there are, you know, recently in New York, there was the Commission on the Status of Women. 159 countries reported on a range of different areas of concern under the Beijing Declaration, which was agreed 30 years ago in Beijing. And there have been changes that have improved women's lives around the world. And that includes maternal mortality, girls' education, and non-discriminatory legislation. So there are improvements, but of course, my area of interest is gender equality and women's empowerment. And within the overall you know, spend on ODA, the focus specifically on women's issues is still quite low. It's always been quite low. So I'm concerned about the decreasing ODA because it is likely to impact the spend on gender equality and women's empowerment, which was already low. So I think that there are a number of concerns there, and we know that it's all the stats show that if we're to reach SDG 5 and the commitments that countries have made to that, it'll be another 300 years before we do so. And we have to continue to have specific spending and investment, getting back to the idea of investment of member states, not just in ODA, but in individual countries, their development spend, and the investment of the private sector also, and development banks, is really crucial. Without specific investment in the areas that hold women back, we will not reach SDG 5 and the other SDGs in the next 5 years. So just with those opening comments, there's plenty more I can say, but I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also for sticking in the time so that we can allow maybe another round and some interaction. It's much appreciated. I think what is very fascinating in both your coverage is that bigger debate on is aid part of a foreign policy agenda of partnering between countries, or is aid a recognition of solidarity within countries and among countries, and in that way a more, let's say, normative orientation as we knew it? And is there also the philosophy that if development actually happens, then there will be mutual gains, of course, and the longer term perspective, but that's then again based on an idea that it's possible to do with external funding development in other countries, and that's of course something that has also been put into question. So that's kind of the overlaying bigger debate. And I think one perspective in that regard that's super interesting is the perspective of Bhutan. Bhutan that has really its own views also on the relationship between the economy and people's happiness and health. And I'm really happy, Sonan Yongchen, that you are here. You're a researcher at the Institute of Health Partners in Bhutan. And I'm very interested to hear from you how you view this health sector and also how it's now affected by the current developments. Please.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Luis, and my fellow panelists. It's a great honor to be in this panel. With regard from Bhutan's perspective, development has always never been about economic growth only. It is about well-being, equity, and sustainability. That's our development philosophy, the gross national happiness that reminds us that progress is meaningless if it does not improve people's quality of life. So unfortunately, what we are witnessing today is a retreat from this broader vision of development. Like the recent geopolitical crisis, economic downtowns, or the pandemics, and the aftershocks of that have led to reallocations of resources away from the fundamental development priorities like health, education, and social protection. Development financing is increasingly being framed through the lens of national security and strategic interests, often at the cost of the most vulnerable population. Susan has also mentioned the education budgets are shrinking in many countries, despite being the foundation of human capital and economic resilience. And since I come from the health, in the health sector, for instance, global health security receives attention only during the public health emergencies like the COVID-19 pandemic, but long-term investment in resilient health systems, especially in low resource settings, remains very neglected in terms of investment. And at the heart of the health is the universal health coverage goal, which is a principle that every individual, regardless of their financial circumstances, should receive the health services they need without facing financial hardship. Yet across our region in the Southeast Asia, it remains still a challenge. I'll just give us statistics. Like in the WHO Southeast Asia region, like around an estimated 326 million people still faced catastrophic health spending, where out-of-pocket health expenses exceeded 10% of the household's total income. So how do we protect such people from catastrophic health expenses? And to do that, what I'm saying is that it should not be only from the OTA, but also the public financing, the country's system, strengthening country's system so that the vulnerable population are protected. One of the lead economists, Mr. Ajay Tandon, is at the World Bank. He mentioned that when our systems pushes people to pay out of pocket for health expenditure when they're sick. It is like equivalent to taxing people for being sick, taxing the most vulnerable people. It's very regressive. It's not progressive. So this is both a public policy failure as well as a moral dilemma which most countries in our region are facing. So countries must really implement mechanisms to provide quality, publicly funded healthcare services, ensuring that health systems do not just technically are viable, but also financially and socially sustainable. And going back to the points raised by the previous speakers, previous two speakers, more on domestic revenues, not just on the ODA. I'll leave here. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I think this is indeed the more, let's say, also normative perspective, and also what it can bring us if more investment takes place in health systems, and this perspective that is not always so clearly discussed and visible anymore, and is also contested by some. But it's also good to hear from the perspective of Bhutan and why the country makes this deliberate choice for this approach and how it helps. And I think essentially in many other countries in the world, there is also still this choice at home to go for the social market economy, where there is public provisions in the sphere of health and education. But in countries that are middle and low income countries, it's way more difficult to achieve this. I think this brings us also to the realm of philanthropy, a long existing practice in some parts of the world. In other parts of the world, it's more new, and it's sometimes also a bit overlooked in the debates on official development assistance. But philanthropy and the role of civil society organizations is maybe a hidden force in today's development world. And we're very happy to have you here, Vanita Sharma, from the Reliance Foundation here in India. We also met last year when we had a session on a fantastic project that you're funding in the agriculture and food space. What can you say about how philanthropy has evolved here in India, and what lessons can be learned from that?
Thanks, Louise, and thank you to the Raisina team for having us here again today. I think India's always had a very strong history of philanthropy, but particularly in the last couple of decades, we've really seen a strong acceleration of investment in the social sector. So, for example, I think recently the Bain report on philanthropy came out, and they were talking about how social sector funding in India has increased by 13% over the last 5 years. I think what we see in India is number one, a very strong focus on social development issues by the government, whether that's at a central level or at a state level. So very strong focus from that side, but also a growing focus from the private sector, especially through the introduction of CSR over the last 10 years. Now we've seen a lot of focus and investment coming from the private sector. Also, a lot of large foundations, private foundations as well, that are contributing towards the ecosystem, including high net worth individuals. So I think what we've really seen in India over the last couple of decades is a strong development sector emerging with a strong focus not just in terms of increasing the amount of capital that there is to fund development issues, but also very much focusing on innovation and a lot of focus on collaboration as well. And I think we've seen that through some of the programs that are emerging in India, whether it's on strengthening rural livelihoods, women-led development, health or education, and some of which are reaching some of the most remote corners of the country. So I think there's a lot that India can share together with other countries as well, to show how a domestic philanthropic ecosystem can really grow and thrive and learn from each other. And I think one of the things that has been really heartening in the last couple of decades is, as I said, not just the focus on increased funding, but also focusing the conversation on how do we ensure that we are seeing impact and how we are measuring impact. So a lot of deep nuance emerging in the sector in terms of how we work and how we work together. And I think we saw that in COVID as well, with a lot of strong work happening across the public and the private sector together.
Right, thank you. Maybe just as a quick follow-up question, Andreas Schaal, and maybe you would also like to respond to what others have said in the first round. I wonder, let's say, how you look at this mix between emergency relief, traditional ODA, philanthropy funding, and then also this loan instruments like Global Gateway and Belt and Road Initiative. And so, how do you see that evolve in the future? Can you say, like, there will always be a need for at least still, 10% of the overall funding for development goals that needs to be emergency relief for the poorest of the poorest, because otherwise direct lives will be at risk? Or is there kind of new ideas emerging in that regard? Or is it philanthropy that you see jumping into the void that states maybe leave at this point in time? Or maybe the low and middle income countries that find new ways to fund development?
No, thanks, Louise. Very, very important question. And yes, I believe there will be always a need and a line for emergency funding. There will be always a need and a line for, let's say, basic needs in least developed countries. There will be always a need to fight hunger and poverty in some countries. But additionally to that, I think the question, and this is what I tried to highlight in the first question, was also echoed by my colleague panelists. I think if you want to attack the systemic questions, what really makes a developing country to an emerging economy or to the ambition to a developed country, these are the drivers of growth, of investment, of trade. These are sound institutions. So for that, you need to ask more the systemic question. What is really transformational to a country? And I remember when we were in Busan, I think it was 2016, we started to have a conversation moving from aid effectiveness to development effectiveness, meaning that it's not just a question of about how much aid you give, but whether the things you're doing, the projects you're doing, have really a systemic catalytic role. And this is something I think we need to, in terms of where we don't see growing resources. In some cases, we rather see shrinking resources. We need to ask ourselves much more: what are the investments which have this kind of systemic, this transformative character? And again, this does not exclude that we continue to support those in need, be it because of emergencies, be it because of structural problems, be it because of market dysfunctionality, such as in agriculture and food markets. But we need to address both, or all, not only both. There are more than two sides of the coin, all sides of the coin.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. Then maybe for you, Susan, you've heard the perspective from Bhutan, which I think is really inspirational. But then if I'm back in Europe, in my own country, the Netherlands, and I watch the news, I see very skeptical views, and there's almost no politician anymore that supports, let's say, spending more on development cooperation. Rather, we see cut after cut after cut. There's huge doubts about aid effectiveness. There's also the perception that we are also poor. The prices in our supermarkets are also high. We have a war going on the continent, so we should take care of ourselves. How can we communicate and also make the case for the need to partner with other countries to stimulate their development? The women's rights, for many years, the sexual reproductive health and rights issue has been high on the agenda. Now it's also kind of elapsed. So what would you recommend, let's say, to politicians in countries like Germany, the UK, the Netherlands? Let's not talk about the US, where we know, of course, what happened. But let's talk about also Australia, your own country. Let's say the others. And
Thanks
maybe
for
also,
that.
and maybe also the rich philanthropies that also maybe say, like, yeah, why should we? What is the benefit?
Well, I suppose the issue is that development for all is a benefit to all. It's a public good. And that we know in countries where there's high inequality, there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of fragility, it holds back people's lives there, and that affects everyone in the world. And so, I mean, that's really why the UN exists, and other such dialogues and collaborations is in recognition of the fact that we all stand or fall together in a way. So I think we do need to make that that stronger, that kind of messaging, and I think we really have to. And I'm saying we, I mean us in the room, but I'm also thinking of governments. Really do need to collaborate with each other and discuss this with each other. And I think there are emerging global leaders like India, I think, that really is wanting to play more of a part in sort of shaping the global discourse and the global development agenda. So I think countries like India can, possibly fill the void of others who are stepping back from these commitments. India has got a huge interest in development in their own country, where there's so much has occurred already to improve development, but there's still more to be done, and India is innovating around that and working out ways of really investing in some of these development issues. And I think India has alliances in Africa and other countries around the world that really I would like to hear more from those countries. And I think that's where a lot of the commitment remains. I think it's all relative also, in that when countries say they are poor, again, that's a very relative idea, isn't it? So I think that there's still a huge need to collaborate on these issues, and to, if we don't, the planet is at risk. So global warming stands as this dark thing. And we have to work together on that. That's a global issue, not just a country issue. No one country. So I mean, that's a very sort of ideological view of mine. But I think that there are a range of different endeavours that we could be placing more emphasis on. So within the there's obviously the UN system, which is straining at the moment, but there are also other dialogues like the G20, like the G77, like various other things where other voices can be heard and can sort of try and reinforce some of these global commitments. So I think that is really important. And I think in terms of gender issues, I mean, the EU is still a firm holder of the idea of gender equality, and I'm very grateful to that. And I think the EU is it's a multilateral system, and there's a lot of ability for the EU to collaborate with other sort of emerging partners around the world to kind of shore up some of these agreements as well. And I think there's good practice that can be like a lever for some of this work in individual countries. So, for example, 15 countries around the world, many of them are a whole range of countries from the global south to global north, have feminist foreign policies, for example, and they codify some of their commitments for gender equality and SDG 5 within those domestic policies, and they have diplomatic engagement around those domestic policies, and they use those to support and shore up funding for women's rights also within their own development aid, based on those policies that have been debated within their countries at election time. So I think the other thing is it's very easy to cut development spending when communities and countries don't care about it. So I think that there's if a country cuts their development budget and there's no outcry from their people, it's a very easy budget saving there. So I think that there needs to be a lot more discourse in countries about what do you benefit from in this as well, because as I said, the poor development affects all of us, and it will wreck the world with climate crisis if we don't do anything about that. So there needs to be a lot more public discourse about this, and that is led by individuals and groups and movements within different countries, especially in the democratic space.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for bringing this broader perspective. I still keep having a bit this question about, this return on investment, so that is constantly being posed. And also, let's say from a European perspective, also the return of investment something else came on top of it, and that was kind of the accusations of being neo-imperialistic and neo-colonial, because the moment you invest or have a financial transfer, there is of course a dependency that comes along with it. So I think that also contributes a bit to the hesitation and is a difficult issue. And I wonder, and I've seen also that our final speaker from the African Union Development Agency has entered, Pamela Gopal. We're pleased to have you here. So I wonder, let's say, what is your perspective? Because we were discussing, these trends in development cooperation, that you see a reduction of direct aid and support programs, but more loan-based programs, and also different ways of financing, higher contributions of philanthropy, and also, more innovative ways and to compensate also for this lack, but also perhaps to depart a bit apart from this idea that it's possible to, with external funding, develop another country in a way. So could you perhaps come in and reflect on this issue from your perspective?
Great, thank you very much, and apologies for sneaking in. I think we are at the junction where we know policies are there normally to promote, to protect, to prosper, to, and see progressiveness in countries. And here we find ourselves in a disruptive policy state right now. More importantly, I think the regional specific implications in Africa alone, in 2022, I think there were over $15.2 billion distributed around African countries. So that is about 40% of the ODA, which impacts the continent very, very, tremendously. For that, because of the regional implications that it has, I just want to allude to the strengthening of regional alliances. I think it is very, very important now. And for example, the African Union, which is a regional body too, the G20, unfortunately now has a seat in this global platform. I think it's very important that we start working together on the shared goals in terms of trade agreements, peace-building initiatives, even infrastructure. I think it's important that countries can harness the power of unity, to mitigate some of these aid cutoffs. A good example of that in the African continent is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's meant to design the reduction of dependency. So I think that is very important. In terms of the South-South cooperation, I think the strengthening of the self-reliance to one another is important. Examples of that, for example, Brazil, in terms of its tropical agricultural, I'm running the risk of might have been repeating what others have said, so I hope not. And in terms of India, for the technological inputs that India, can serve as models to the nations of the global south. Advocating for multilateralism is also important, but countries also find themselves having a need to sort of put the mask on themselves first, oxygen mask, before helping one another, and by all means, because they have the citizens at their best interest. But of course, platforms like the United Nations, the BRICS, can champion some of these international financial systems, as well as be representative in the global decision making. And a good example of that is the new development bank that can also provide alternative funding for global South nations. Most importantly, I think, and we saw it in the African Union Development Agency, for example, when COVID, we were faced with that pandemic, we looked internally and we found homegrown solutions. And I think that is also important, localizing that approach in terms of empowering local entrepreneurs. India also serves as a good example of that. I think overall it's important, like we have this dialogue now, engaging in these dialogues. For sure, the organizers last year, when thinking of this, never thought that we'll be faced with something like this. So I think the speed and pace in which we work together is very important, because these immediate policy changes make both a short-term and a long-term impact. And it's important now that we collaborate to, as we faced with these risks, it's important now as eye-openers to make sure we take a unified approach. So I'll leave it as that. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing in this South-South perspective, but also the BRICS and the New Development Bank. I think these are very important points to bring into the discussion, and also for being positive, because especially with regards to the health sector, of course, we have seen devastating documentaries on television of what happens with the US aid withdrawal from the health sector also in Africa. And maybe, Sonam, because you're a health systems researcher and you just made a fantastic plea for the need to strengthen health systems on the ground. Do you agree? Do you see also that countries are really now because of the shock that is being brought, coming up with new and innovative approaches?
Yes, thank you for this question. I would like to echo what has been said by Pamela in terms of the shocks presented right now in the health system, not just in the health system, but overall disruptions. Maybe countries should really lead in setting their own development priorities, not just relying on the external aid. And as highlighted by Pamela in terms of regional alliance, maybe the coalition of actors like regional partnerships like BIMSTEC and ASEAN in our region can advocate more for financing models that rely less on the major powers. That's what I would like to highlight, one point. The other one is philanthropy and social investors can step in, mobilizing domestic resources to fill in the gaps where multilateral funding is declining. And small nation, again coming to my country, Bhutan, can offer models of sustainable and holistic development, proving that well-being has to take precedence over just economic or growth alone. And you did mention about the disruptions, the colonization. In terms of the health system, what I feel is decolonization that's happening that might not be relevant to all other countries, but especially in small developing countries like Bhutan. One of the most yet overlooked concern is the human resources for health, where a new form of colonization is emerging, where high-income countries are systematically recruiting health professionals from the global south, depleting the very systems that need them the most. So this is not just about money. It's about moral and social costs of draining talent from the regions that invested in their training. So I leave here. Thank you.
The brain drain element, it's also an important point to bring to the table. Vanita Sharma from the Reliance Foundation, a lot has been said also about India and how it can showcase with its model and also with a strong philanthropical actor like you at the Reliance Foundation. How do you view the building of this resilience on a more structural level in other countries? What can you share in terms of experience, and how do you view what India is already doing with regards to South-South cooperation?
Thanks, Louise. So I think from an India perspective, I think one is the very strong focus on collaboration, and that's something that we focus on very strongly. So whether that's working together with with the government on certain initiatives, because where the philanthropic sector can help to develop innovative new models, but the government can be able to take it to scale, whether that's at a central level or a state level. That's something that we're working on, for example, in early childhood, where we're working together with various states on helping to strengthen early childhood and education and helping develop best practices, which then the state can take to scale, or where we're working in women's empowerment and we're working together to help strengthen 1 million women rural entrepreneurs. And again, they're develop best practices that various states can then take to scale. So I think one is that, the collaboration model between philanthropic organizations and the government is absolutely key. The second is collaboration between each other as well. So working together with other foundations, even if that's just to understand what each other are doing, so that there's you're avoiding duplication of efforts in the same states, the same areas of work, and how can you work together on different issues, but you address different pieces of the puzzle and the pie. So I think India offers like a lot of good examples there of different collaboration models between different philanthropic foundations. I think I think both Susan and Pamela touched on also the potential for South-South learning, and I think regional cooperation doesn't need to just involve sharing of funding. There's a lot of value that comes out from sharing of learning, where countries are facing common issues and there are common solutions. So, for example, next week we're actually doing a convening together with the UN to share best practices around early warning and early action, where we'll have some international experts joining us from other countries like Nepal and Mongolia and Kenya, where we can share best practices and where we can learn from them as well. So I think that's really, really important. I think the other lesson from India is the focus on really having a vibrant grassroots social sector network. So, India has a lot of excellent grassroots organizations that are the organizations that help reach the last mile. So really focusing on what we can do to strengthen them. They work together with various foundations and helping strengthen their capacity to be able to deliver. And I think just finally, technology. I think technology is the key driver and has been such a key driver for India, with both the growth of digital and the focus on digital public infrastructure. So how can we leverage technology much more effectively in the coming years, especially given how technology and AI will disrupt all sectors in the future. So making sure that we're leveraging technology in good ways to reach the last mile and sharing those learnings with other countries.
Thank you. Pamela, maybe, because I also wanted to open for the questions, but maybe you would like to respond still to what you've heard from others. And I was wondering, do you also see in Africa cases where philanthropy and states are cooperating so well and jointly taking? So do you see the India model also being exported in African contexts?
Yes, I just want to also add to this that in cases of this, we are going to expect fatalities. I think it's normal, and we do know that. But I think also the ability to bounce back is very, very important. Africa has not only alliance, with the US, we have with Japan, with China, with India, the EU. And I think it's really important in terms of philanthropy. Apart from just that, we also have the private sector that's also very, very strong. And I think that is opening up in terms of also its multilateral development banks and how then they come to the party. I know that the World Bank is also increasing its aid. But in a way, it's devastating because it just sort of happens and everyone's got to adapt. And we know that even as I alluded to the African continental free trade, it takes time. It takes time, and in the African continent, there's 55 countries. And each country goes through leadership change every 4 years. Some of them, have 2 or 3, even 4 terms. But we see the national disruption even with it at a local and a national scale. And of course, at a global scale, we really, Africa has good allies with the rest of the world. So I think it's important to leverage of that. I think I don't have the stats with me now, but also we are recipients of a good dosage of philanthropy. For example, even the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in fact, I neglected looking at what they have to say about all the geopolitical tensions, but they also contribute a lot. And there's a few examples. We have the Bill Clinton initiative as well that contributes a lot, and the Germans, etc. So I think that it's time, that we can re-collaborate and make sure that we are, as I said before, have the oxygen mask on individually first before trying to help others. I think it's very, very important that countries have to take that approach. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And it's also very nice expression, the oxygen mask. I like it very much. Thank you all for these brilliant contributions. I wanted to open up for the floor. Are there any questions? I see two men here you first and then you, please. Please, and introduce yourself shortly and then ask your question.
Hi, my name is Bjorn Lomborg. I run the Copenhagen Consensus. We work a lot with prioritization. I just wonder, the goal of this was how do we refocus global efforts to do more development? And it strikes me that, you were talking, Andreas, about how we need 4 trillion, how we need, Susan, you talked about how we need another $300 billion. But the real challenge here is we don't even have that. We don't have anywhere near that. So isn't the first goal, and I thought, Luis, you were trying to push it a lot, but I didn't hear you guys talk a lot about it. We need to emphasize that this is really spent well, because that's what the conversation, both in the US, but also everywhere else, is. A lot of the feeling is that it's not spent well. So don't we need to get back and say, we are spending your money in the best possible way?
Yeah. All right. Thank you. And thank you for a concrete question. Yeah, please. And then we go to Darren. First Darren. Yeah.
I'm Seiko. We own a private equity firm in the US with assets under management of about $300 billion. We are right now, I met your king in December when he was here in India. So my question is, do we still need development assistance? I mean, our conversation with Bhutan's king was that there is one thing that you have to take responsibility of your people, right? When you would take responsibility of people, you'll say, give me aid and then I'll help my people. That won't work, right? So we are helping your country. I'm working with a drug holding and investment firm to put about $10 billion into your country with a tentative estimate that your country's GDP will increase right now from $5 billion to almost $100 billion. Similarly, I was speaking to President Felix when he was the African Union president. I told him, with a country like yours, which has got a resource base of $36 trillion, what you need to do is convert them into bonds against which I can invest, right? Rather than seeking development assistance, which is peanuts. So the last thing is Basel III guidelines, which is what governs us as financial institutions. They need highly liquid quality assets. They don't classify aid into any of those segments. Even if you look into the green bonds, it doesn't come into that L1 category, which is a 0% haircut for me as an investor, right? So I'm saying, do we see a future for ODA when the world wants so much of aspirations to be fulfilled? Will we say we will only need assistance to do that?
All right, thank you. Thought-provoking question as well, and also pointing to these other ways of financing and innovative ways of financing. There was a question in the back.
Yes, I might respond a bit to that I don't think it's peanuts when you see what's happening with USA.
Please also introduce yourself.
Around the world. I'm Melissa. I'm from the Asia-Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. And this is exactly what we do, trying to make the case for development aid in a country like Australia, which is not poor and is able to assist. We were set up by our funding from our Defence Department and our Foreign Affairs Department and the House at the peak body for the aid sector. And there is a real sense in what we're doing that you've got to make the argument that this is a key tool of statecraft. That development is something that makes us safer. So I was conscious, the sort of arguments you make for philanthropists, for individuals, about solidarity, humanity, I agree with them. But I think what you have to make at a government level is the argument that this is a wise use of taxpayer money. And I think, Sonam, you talked about it in terms of systems. I think you can make those arguments. You can say, if we don't fund health systems, there are more communicable diseases in our country. If we don't fund climate adaptation, we'll have climate refugees. If we don't fund good governance, we'll have collapsed states. Anyway, I know you want me to ask a question, but I did actually just want to talk about what is happening in this area. I would say, and this is probably, it's more a call than a question, is to say don't let developed countries off the hook on this. I think it's very important that we don't just say, oh, it's okay, we'll just let development funding go. There are constituencies in countries that you can mobilise. They need to say, as Susan said, that this has costs, that this is not something that these countries should do. And I think for OECD donors like Australia, Japan, South Korea, we can step up. And I think for South-South collaboration, that's something I learn a lot about every time I come here. I think that's such an area we should be focusing on so much. So I don't think we let the aid cuts be treated as normal. They're not normal and they're not acceptable.
All right, thank you. So very different perspectives. I see that officially the time is up. I hope that I can give all the speakers 1 minute just to answer the questions that have been raised, and then we will finish off. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. Yeah, please.
Great, thank
Half
you.
a minute or a minute.
Thank you for the question about financing gaps. I do know that I don't know if the others have touched, but I certainly haven't. We know that we aren't able to achieve the SDGs in the African continent. We aren't able to achieve the Agenda 2063, but these are aspirational goals that we all work towards and strive towards. I don't think we're going to ever have enough capital to fill these gaps, but therefore the collaboration and unifying approach on how countries collaborate, how going forward the lessons have learned from this. We can trade with another. Of course, we don't have all. We can't have all the goods. We have to trade with one another. But there's a level of dependency on certain areas, certain skills that we don't have, etc. So I think to answer that, we might not have the resources completely at all times, but the collaboration on leveraging what we have best and leveraging from our strengths are important. I do agree. At the African Union Development Agency, we did, a 5% agenda, which was also leveraging from governments to plug in to sovereign wealth and pension funds. I think that is the real way to go. And I think a lot relies on infrastructure projects as well. So we have been working on this now for a while, and even with the homegrown solutions and the SMMEs, because I think also they help generate a lot of economic growth, and then especially in Africa, it's about 85% of the small, medium enterprises that contribute to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all, and thank you for the fantastic participation.